What's up? Got a little faith and holy Moses, do I have a show for you today. You are listening to the 4th episode of the 2nd season of the Fagnostic Podcast, and I'm your host, Matt Hayes. In honor of Ash Wednesday and 420, surrounded by pagan celebrations of Easter traditions, the Seder plate's reminder of the epic journey of the Israelites, I have a Moses expert on to talk about his incredibly thought-provoking book, Moses and the Death of Heresy. J.M.S. Beale is a lifelong student of religion, both academically and in religious communities. His degree is in comparative religion, and his focus was on the culture and history of ancient Israel. His dreams of becoming the pastor of a church were dashed when he realized he could not defend or endorse the use of power in his Christian communities. Since then, he has become a devoted ally of the LGBTQ+ community. His book, Moses and the Death of Heresy, is an exposé of how power is fundamentally attached to violence in the legacy of Moses. The book gives value to the lives that were taken by this ancient aggression, the trauma of the survivors, and gives modern readers a roadmap for how to escape such uses of power in their own spiritual lives. So buckle up, buttercups, and get ready to open your mind to the possibility that maybe Moses wasn't all he's cracked up to be. Seth, I am your new biggest fan. Thank you for being here, first of all. I just finished your book, Moses and the Death of Heresy. And I want to talk about how I came to be aware of this book, which I attribute to the assertiveness on your part. And I really thank you for that. So first of all, welcome to the show. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
And I have 2 questions I start every episode off with. The first being, are you a believer?
This used to mean something different when I said yes, but I believe that there is something bigger than what humans are and what this earth is that has made it so that there is something that exists instead of nothing.
Sure.
I don't have a lot of confidence about how to define the parameters of that, but I'm definitely inclined in that direction, but no longer willing to advocate heavily for that position and tell other people that they need to.
Sure. Great. And then can you also identify your pronouns for us?
Yes, he and him.
Great. Thank you. So we're just going to jump right in. This book fucks with everything that the Bible purports to be, whether it be the Christian Bible or the Hebrew Bible, or really even the Quran. I don't even know where to start with this. I gave a crazy review on social media today about this book because I could not put it down. It was a very slow read. When I got it, I thought, oh, this will be a really easy read. It looks like, like good size font, it's less than 200 pages. And then it took me like 2 full days of like 12-hour shifts to finish reading because I had to go over and like circle back and go back to other pages so much. Not to daunt anyone from thinking they can get through this because it is very easy to understand your points, I think. It just was so much information that countered traditional thought that it just was, I was having to deconstruct in the process of receiving this new information. I shouldn't even call it new information because, everything you reference is considered is either the holy text or it's from people within the first 3 generations of the Common Era that were basically giving their firsthand accounts of these things, or first, second, or third accounts. You found my podcast and reached out to me.
I did, yes.
How did you find my podcast, first of all?
I was searching through because I wanted to be. I like to be choosy in my life when I have the luxury to do so. Part of what I feel like can make life pleasurable is having that luxury of being able to choose what we might prefer. And so I was looking through the catalog of various religious podcasts, and equal rights for people in the LGBTQ plus community is near and dear to my heart. And so seeing that you had a clever and sassy and a little irreverent title kind of caught me. I was like, oh, that's bold, because the reclamation of that term is a pretty intense thing. I grew up in an era in the Midwest where nobody thought twice about playing the horrible football game Smear the Queer. And to follow the arc through in my own life of, I'm trying to think if maybe when my sister introduced me to the Indigo Girls was the first time that I really kind of learned in a specific way about gay people doing things that I liked, like gay people I knew existed in the culture, but where I actually started to have an emotional connection to somebody who didn't identify with the heteronormative experience. And then figuring out, because I was introduced to the Indigo Girls first, and then later kind of got really into Christianity for my own choosing. Like I grew up in the church, my parents took me, but they didn't indoctrinate me the way that I self-indoctrinated in my late teens.
Interesting.
I got really into a community, and my personality just lends me to wanting to, I love trust and being trusted. And so when I started receiving the trust of my religious leaders and seeing the types of things they wanted to give me more trust and more responsibility for doing, I was on board, and I was just listening to sermons on my lunch break at work, like on the radio in Columbus. And but there's a whole long story getting into that.
Sure. But you did grow up Christian.
I did. My parents took us to a Methodist church. My dad thought it was good for the formation of morals, and they chose our particular church in Columbus where they had a good choir. My mom really liked to sing. And I grew up, my mom would lead us through the "Now I lay me down to sleep" prayer each night when I was little. I don't know when that stopped. But my dad was a skeptic. He grew up with really severe Baptist parents, and he was whip smart and loved to read. And he ended up being an engineer and giving much more value to the tools of science than the tools of religion. And he said he was working on a farm at the time of one of their neighbors. And he said he would just sit there on the tractor, disking a field, which is where you cut up the clods of dirt that come up after you plow to make it more even. And he said, I would save all my contemplation about whether or not I wanted to participate in my parents' version of religion for the days I was disking the fields, because I didn't have to think about much other than that.
Sure. Well, when was it then that, I mean, after your self-indoctrination, did you think maybe Moses isn't all he's cracked up to be based on these very obvious context clues laid out in the Bible?
It started when I was in my sophomore year in college. It was
where did you go?
I went to Ohio State University.
Oh, you're a Buckeye.
Yeah, you're an Auburn guy, right?
No, yes, I am.
Yeah, and we didn't have so many head-to-head battles there, but
It's
I know
because
that
the Buckeyes only play community colleges. That's a whole other.
Yeah, it's not an SEC school when it comes to football for sure. Yeah, so I went there, and that fall, 98, was when Steven Spielberg, David Geffen, and Jeffrey Katzenberg had formed DreamWorks. And their first big family film that they released was The Prince of Egypt.
Yep.
Like, it was such a get at the time that they got Val Kilmer to do the voice of Moses, and Ralph Fiennes is the voice of Ramses, his brother. And it's this animated musical. It's basically a retelling of the Charlton Heston movie, The Ten Commandments. And I'd grown up where every Easter weekend, they still broadcast the Ten Commandments on ABC television network.
Yeah.
And so I was familiar with the story of Moses mostly through that, because my church upbringing didn't have a lot of Old Testament exposure. Most of the sermons were New Testament, like they are in most Christian churches, because that's the Christian book. And what shifted that year for me is that I was taking a class in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, where instead of studying the Hebrew language, we were studying the cultural context of the Old Testament. And so my homework every night was reading parts of the Torah, which I had never really read: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy in my Christian life. And so my homework was looking at
and just so our listeners know, those 5 books represent what we call the Torah.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Please, at any moment where I'm talking where you think that your listeners would benefit, please reel me back in.
For sure.
But so that's the only source document we have for the life of Moses. We have nothing in the archaeological record, nothing in Egyptian records. And so I'm reading those source texts, and then I'm watching the movie and watching the new animated movie. And these are completely different human beings that are depicted.
Yes.
as far as like going back a little to whether or not I'm a believer, like I believe that the story of Moses is real. I
You
believe
do.
that it existed.
Okay.
I believe that there are all sorts of things that are going on right now in Egypt and archaeology where the idea that Moses didn't exist really gained traction in the past 150 years because we couldn't find any mention in the Egyptian records, which are extensive records for that era. But what happened and what is documented in the Egyptian account is that there was a huge cataclysm that happened in the ancient Near East. And it was one of the islands in the Greek archipelago. Back then it was called Thera. Now it's called Santorini. And
Mm-hmm.
your listeners can Google Santorini right now. And if you look at the satellite view, it's a giant volcanic caldera. Like
I've been there many times, and they have like the mud baths you can actually visit in that center section, because people also surmise that it could be the city of Atlantis.
Yeah, I've heard
There's
that
a lot
theory
of
as well.
cool conspiracies about Santorini.
So it was this Santorini was the epicenter of Minoan culture, which dominated the whole Mediterranean at that time. It predates the Greek civilization center in Athens. But when that island erupted, it's geologists think it was the largest volcanic event that human beings have lived through on the planet. I don't know if you saw the images from Tonga, and they have satellite images of the eruption that happened back in January. And the eruption of Thera was believed to be 200 times the magnitude of that massive shockwave. So it's 7 times stronger than the Krakatoa event that happened in the late 1800s. And what archaeologists are realizing and biblical historians are trying to figure out is it seems like we have the timeline of Egyptian history a little wrong, because Egyptian history is dated based on biblical history. That there's a moment where a pharaoh comes up in the 4th year of King Rehoboam, who's Solomon's son, and he plunders the Jewish temple. And that moment where those two kingdoms intersect is what we use to backdate all of biblical history and Egyptian history.
Right.
But what it seems has happened is that the name of the pharaoh who is identified there was incorrect for centuries. And so there's this willingness to reevaluate what happened. Right. But if you look at the basic timeline of events, and I don't want to assume that they necessarily got everything perfectly right. I think the biblical dating of saying 480 years exactly is probably not correct.
Right.
From that moment back to the Exodus. But what we know for certain is that the Egyptians described this moment and this eruption as a blast from God that came out of nowhere. And in the aftermath, Egypt was so severely damaged that a foreign group of Asiatic people called the Hyksos came in and conquered the northern delta portion of Egypt for 130 years. So if that timeline works out, then the possibility of the Exodus happening wouldn't have been documented because Egypt was covered in volcanic ash and whatever damage the shockwave did. So that's the place where I think that if we're going to treat this as a literal event that both the Egyptians and the Hebrew people document as a cataclysm of God, like that's the best likely location for it. So I operate off of that. And what I do in the book is I believe the Hebrew story. I don't try to go outside of their timeline. They're the only source for it. And so much of what our world has become, both religiously and then because the laws of Moses became codified into various legal systems around the world, that his influence permeates so many things. And I want to believe that the people who were the most direct descendants of his culture knew what they were talking about. And I give them the benefit of the doubt. And so I don't question their basic facts. I just look at some of the other facts that they included that we don't often talk about.
Right. And because, one of the things that I hate about mainstream religion, especially, evangelical sect, is that people believe what they're told to believe. They don't do a lot of studying on their own. And I even felt guilty reading this of the things that I chose not to believe in were things that I was just told to believe as well. And for instance, like I love how simple you put it also when assuming in order to believe that Moses was this, this hailed leader in a region that hated the very people he came from, we would have to assume that there was no other bloodline from Pharaoh. There was no other worthy male candidate, even with the adopted mother. That no one else in that entire polygamous, setting of regality could have inherited the throne or leadership from Pharaoh. So why would we believe? I mean, just at that alone, why would we believe the story that Moses was chosen? I mean, he was hated. I mean, even recognizing the fact that he was the only one who didn't have foreskin. And that would have been a big indicator as to, oh, you're from the other side of the river and we hate those people. We're going to, we had just declared that every male be drowned in this alligator infested river. And then, but you keep going. And I mean, I just don't know where to start with this because it just changed and upended every perception of the Bible that I had by simply pointing out verses that are there and we just skimp over because they're wordy and they don't make sense and they refer to God as a different word. Like I actually went through and I pulled out my old Bible and looked at where are they calling him Yahweh, where are they calling him El, because I didn't realize even with the Israelites, I have always associated Israelite Judaism. The two are synonymous in my head. And it's not at all that way. The Israelites had many gods that they worshiped and prayed and created altars for. And then just with the idea, and I don't want to give away too much of the book because I want people to go and support you, by buying it. But like, even the way that you vindicated Aaron, this guy that we just thought was just this schlum who, was just desperate to, to steal the victory from his brother or to steal that attention. And he was just doing his brother service by like leading these people in their religious ceremonies still. And the more I got through this book, the more that I was just getting angry at Moses. And I was realizing that I'd always thought that I was pissed at God for how religion is weaponized now. And I don't think it's God's fault. It's this guy, Moses. He weaponized religion. He created the definition of heresy. How much did this book, in writing it, do for your own religious trauma healing?
Thank you for asking. When I left the church, it was the first moment in my life where I experienced depression. My dad was an entrepreneur and I was working at his company, and I would clock in, I would sit there and play. Like there were like 4 games on the old Microsoft Office suite that you could play. And I would sit there and I was supposed to be doing administrative tasks for his business. And I would sit there for like 6 hours just playing like Tetris, Solitaire, Free Cell, and Minesweeper just over and over again, and trying to make sense of the experience of leaving an evangelical church experience where I had leaders who I trusted and admired and wanted to emulate who would say things to me like, we need to be prepared as Christians to die to protect the idea that Jesus is equal in stature and substance with God. And so when I started questioning those things and separating it from it, it was like somebody had ripped the roof off of my house and a storm was coming. And I just didn't know what to do. I just sat there and just got soaked with sadness and frustration and anger and all the experiences of displeasure that get layered into that muck of depression. And what I love about the church, and even looking back, what I think was so beautiful to me is the church helped rescue me from adolescent experiences of isolation and loneliness. But what it introduced to me was a layer of self-hatred for my own flaws that became so intense. And the more that I expressed my remorse about my own failures to act in the ways that the community wanted me to, the more I was rewarded for that. Like it was a sign of being a serious Christian, the more that you felt bad about your own natural impulses. Like most people that are really involved in the church in their teens and 20s, like masturbating was the chief sin that I was confessing over and over again to my prayer partners. And I, two of my closest friends to this day are people that I met during that time, and we would confess sin to each other.
Yeah.
And what I love about that is, outside of the recovery community of various 12-step programs and the evangelical church, I don't know anybody who takes confession of shameful behavior as seriously as those two communities. And
agreed.
And my ability to inhabit a moment where I feel shamed and find a way to speak about it and to make peace with somebody where my shame might be connected to offending somebody else. Like, I love that those skills exist, and I'm grateful to the church and my experiences there for that. But when I left the church, I met a friend from the dance department at Ohio State University, where they had a really talented group of people, and I started going to their parties. And I was introduced to a community where policing exactly what I thought and my exact content of the thoughts that I was having about God or Jesus was irrelevant or just not important. And to just return to the physicality, I got to listen to your episode where you and Garrett, your brother, are talking, and I know that athletics are a part of your life, and I really enjoyed his cleverness of coining the term an athletic fundamentalist. Really fun. But so getting into dance, and they did yoga classes through the dance department, and I started meditating, doing dance improvisation stuff. I never really got into performance. I performed in one friend's MFA graduate concert where he needed people that looked like they didn't know how to dance very well.
Sure.
And I was happy to provide that for him. But in that community, it helped me learn to be forgiving of myself in a way that I couldn't access in the church. I know that there are religious people that are good at learning to be forgiving of themselves, but I was not in a community where that was likely going to happen.
Absolutely.
So it was really nice to experience the liberty from that. When it comes to the book, I mean, the first part of this came just from that contrast of looking at the movies of Moses, which are like an intense codification visually of all the legends that people have told about Moses, like all the people that have just made stuff up. When I was
even coming from people you don't expect, like Spielberg, like DeMille, like Sigmund Freud. I mean, these names that really have no stake in the game in terms of like preserving the religion. I mean, I guess, I don't know how religious Spielberg is, but if this upends so many belief systems that I have a hard time articulating the weight of this book for me. But I do have like a certain number of pages earmarked that I want to just like ask questions on that I think will kind of help guide people as to the theme of this book. The first one is Moses's name in and of itself. The name Moses is typically part of a name because it means begotten or born of. And because we have no record of his adolescence or his young adult years, except for the basket in the river moment, which even in the Prince of Egypt animated film is completely Hollywoodized. But the idea would be that he would have had to drop the where his name came from portion of Moses, because he came from the Nile, and if the Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses, it was to honor where he came from. And I don't think she would have honored his heritage, but she would have honored where she found him. So the theory is that his name would have been Moses, which means is born from the Nile god, happy. But if he was creating these rules of this new monotheistic religious idea, he could not have given any homage to a pluralistic God environment. I don't know if I'm saying any of this right, but I just find it interesting that even Moses's name probably is a misinformation tactic on the behalf of these early authors, right?
Yeah, I mean, back then, the name Moses was very distinctive among the Hebrew people because it's not a Hebrew name.
Right.
So we have a lot of documentation of names, like a lot of the parts of the Old Testament that people skip over when they read it are just long lists of names. And Moses doesn't exist because Moses is a suffix from Egyptian culture. And we know of at least 18 pharaohs. So this is a common name amongst the royal houses where Moses was part of their names. And it's always the name of a god and then Moses as the suffix, meaning that this divine child who will take the throne of Egypt is blessed by this particular god. So the most popular one is the sun god Ra, which was the eventually became the chief deity amongst the Egyptian pantheon. And so we have a bunch of pharaohs named Ra Moses, or we usually say in English Ramses.
Yes,
but it's Ra Moses, and then
which is the fictional brother of Moses in the film, right?
And all that is based on that old chronology where people are trying to find the moment in archaeology, like where does Moses fit into Egypt? Because once the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799, suddenly, like when the Islamic people conquered Egypt in the 4th century, or sorry, my data is a little off. So people took over Egypt and the kingdoms and the dynasties ended around the 4th century. Then we lost access to it in the West. So we didn't know what hieroglyphics meant. And we have, in the book, I include a little snippet of a lecture from a German specialist in Egypt. And he refers to the hieroglyphics as these mysteries that we don't know what they mean. And just a mere few decades later, we had fully translated vast catalogs of Egyptian artifacts and wall carvings and things because we knew how to read hieroglyphics. Experience of this Egyptian culture. And so people were then like really motivated, especially Christians, and at the dawn of the 1900s when American fundamentalism exists, and they're trying to prove everything in the Bible. Most of early archaeology in Israel is Christian archaeologists trying to prove that the Bible is literally true. And so they try to fit Moses into that. And so they think somewhere around the reign of Ramses II is when Moses would have been alive. And then it was just fun for authors to create a sibling rivalry between the most famous and lavish pharaoh of all time and Moses, kind of the underdog from the enslaved people. And they just took it and ran with it and made thousands and thousands of pages and at least 3 full-length feature films about it. And Moses just kept getting better and better over time.
And then at the end of the chapter called The Hero We Need, which is in the first part of the book still, the end of the chapter, I have it circled, but it's perhaps the silence of the Torah regarding Moses' formative years is an unintended gift to humanity. Because so few details are known about the first decades of Moses' life, it is easier to shape him into whatever mold most serves our needs. Thus, each retelling of Moses' history since the Bible likely tells us more about the author than it does about Moses himself, which I also found interesting because it seems that they used that void of information to create this story about Moses in order to elevate him to savior status, to justify why his view of religion should be the only one that is honored.
Absolutely. And I feel like I want to pause for just a quick moment because my Jewish friends in the here and now, the one who I feel has been kind of like a guidepost for me about how to approach Judaism. She looks at sacred books like the Torah and the entire Levitical code, which is all the laws and regulations of society, but mostly about how religion functions. And she says, oh, we just call that in my synagogue, that's the part we don't do anymore. And I want to and I do this in the book, but I want to celebrate the diversity, that the idea that I'm not, and the book is not written to try to undermine Judaism as a whole. I'm going after power structures. I want to know about the question that was in my heart as I was writing, especially the second part of the book, is how do we get to the point where people treat religion as a matter of life and death? And that requires a reexamination of Moses. And,
yes.
And exactly as you're saying, and what I kind of unfold a lot in chapter 2, is that each author who touches the story when we contextualize it and we try to have compassion and understanding of why would this person be motivated to celebrate Moses as a powerful military hero, which Josephus, who is kind of the chief Jewish historian from the first century AD or Common Era, he was a failed military leader who had witnessed the destruction of Israel in his lifetime by the Roman Empire. And he had lost a horrific battle to Roman armies when he was a leader. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, he amplifies this intense idea that Moses was the most clever tactical general in the history of the Mediterranean. But he doesn't cite a source for it. We don't have any idea where it comes from other than maybe Josephus's heart, that Moses was his hero, and why he was heroic to Josephus was because he had military skills that maybe Josephus himself lacked in that moment. And so there's a moment where it's like,
because even that is assuming that Moses would have been given proper military training, and we have to allow the fact, allow the possibility that he didn't. Why would Pharaoh give this bastard child, essentially, from a population that you were trying to just diminish and kill? Why would you give him any training or any notoriety or any? And then for when Moses killed the man attacking the Israelite, he did it and felt guilty and felt scared and felt like he had to hide. Yeah. I mean, there's just so many clues that are in the actual Bible. This is not stuff that you're just pulling out of your ass. This is looking at verses that we ignore and then reading them in context and sequence and saying, but wait, how do we get this belief system based when these verses are saying something completely different and a little more problematic?
It's really, I mean, one of the things that it puts into contrast in my experience, my wife's family practices a pretty casual version of Judaism where we would have her father passed a few years ago, and he was like the patriarch of the Jewish practices in the family. And we would go to his house and we would read the story of Moses, and it's all truncated because it has to be a short event that families can attend and children can be present for. So just for the sake of practicality and time, you can't include all the details. And then if you're at a family event, you might not want to talk about some of the parts where some pretty intense violence is mentioned.
Sure.
And so the stories, that festival gets repeated every single year in Jewish practice. It's one of the high holy days, is the celebration of Passover. And so which
I also love celebrating as well. It's a beautiful holiday, and it's so familial. This episode's probably going to drop around the week of Easter, Passover, intentionally, because I think it's going to be, because the context. The thing that I loved that you did in the book was your vindication of Aaron, and I want to visit that for a bit as well. Because in the Bible, we look at Aaron as just committing this terrible, unforgivable sin of building this idol after the 10 commandments had been delivered, and the second commandment being, you shall have no other idols before me. I'm the Lord your God, Yahweh, and which was a new name for God. Before Yahweh, it was El. And you know, a lot of people, like, I immediately thought of the song El Shaddai, even though we don't really know what El Shaddai, what version of God or what level of God El Shaddai refers to. We know that it is a holy title, but El meaning God, and Moses, through his own spiritual calling or whatnot, decided that he is hearing God speak as Yahweh. And so we have to pay attention also to when God is speaking in the Bible, referring to himself. And I hate gendering God as him. It's one of my biggest pet peeves in the entire world, because it just perpetuates the power structure that many religions thrive off of. But and you're going to have to correct me, because I know I'm going to destroy this. But basically, Moses was seeing the way that people had this casual relationship with the divine. And by casual, it doesn't mean disrespectful or lazy. It means a free spiritual experience to give gratitude and love the divine through whatever ways you felt were important to you, whether it be through cooking for a neighbor, through having a good old-fashioned picnic with your friends and your family. Those are ways that people honor the divine, El. Moses decided after the 10 commandments were delivered to him and only him that there's one God. There is no multiple way to worship God. There's a set of rules that you have to follow. So now all of a sudden there are repercussions for not following the rules, because when he came down and saw Aaron had built this golden calf, which actually was honoring their past traditions, and not in a way that dishonored God, but in a way that directly honored who they knew God to be, which was a bull god. Right?
Exactly. So one of the things that I'm not sure if all your listeners will know right away, but Aaron is the biological brother of Moses, but they were separated when Moses was 3 months old. Moses goes off to the Egyptian palace. Aaron stays and lives amongst the enslaved Israelites in Egypt. And so all this and all the things we're going to be talking about are the stories of the Bible, but I try to reinterpret them with a compassionate approach for what would normally be the unsung heroes. And Aaron has always been vilified because after the Israelites the cataclysm happens, I believe poetically told by the biblical authors as 10 plagues. Like if we just focus on a few other species of animal, maybe we have 14 plagues that would have been disrupted ecologically by a big cataclysm. But so we get to this moment, Moses leads them to Mount Sinai, and there's a lot of people are very excited to try to identify which mountain in either the Sinai Peninsula or the Eastern Arabian Peninsula, the Southwestern Arabian Peninsula would have been the likely place for Mount Sinai. We don't know where it is. And from my perspective,
scores of thousands of people, right?
That is, according to the book of Numbers, 600,000 men of fighting age come out, but that is not supported anywhere by an archaeological record. That would have been, if you account for women and children amongst the Hebrew population at that time, that puts the population at something like 2.5 million.
Right.
And that would be more people than lived in all of Egypt itself. So when those numbers are given in the Torah later, they all end with an even 100 number. So it's like 54,600 people. That's not a real number. I'm just giving an example, except for one ends in 50. And so it seems like these are embellishments later. They kind of match the number of Israelites who, after the exile in Babylon, are coming back to Israel much later in their history. So it's hard to make sense of the numbers, but we know that some sizable portion of people Moses leads to the base of Mount Sinai, which is a foreign land. All of these Israelites spent their entire lives in the delta region of Egypt, which is pretty flat. And so they go to a mountain for the first time. And the descriptions in the Torah suggest that it's a volcano. It says that the mountain is on fire at the top at night, and in the daytime, it's covered with smoke or a cloud. And that's what volcanoes look like when they're active.
Right.
And
at that time, not knowing about geology, it would be safe for someone to imagine, after being delivered, that this is a spiritual experience of the divine, by seeing this, what should be a normal rock-looking figure, all of a sudden has fire and smoke coming from it. Well, that doesn't make sense. That has to be God. And so if this one individual then comes down from this visual, religious experience, we're going to believe what he says. And what he says was, you're all wrong. You have to follow my rules. And those who don't, you're going to be punished. And this is the first instance of heresy or heretical thinking.
Exactly. So heresy is a word that's maybe thrown around in Christian communities, and we don't use a lot outside of strict religious settings. But heresy just means doing something different than the authorities say is correct. And that could be intentional. It could be rebellious, but it's really a word that's about difference or deviation. But if there's no punishment for acting differently, then heresy is meaningless. It just means diversity. And so
at this point also in the Bible, there's no punishment for disobeying a religious structure, because it really is no religious rule following. The only thing they had to do was circumcise their sons. There's no other rule whatsoever, and there's no punishment. There's no heaven and hell until Moses gives us this repercussion experience.
Yeah, we get into, so early in the Bible, you have the Genesis story. God creates heaven and earth. And then there's the big flood with Noah's
Mm-hmm.
Ark. You can watch Russell Crowe pretend to be Noah if you want to see a
Yeah.
film. But those were like the storytelling is that there was some generic wickedness of humanity as a whole. It's not specific. And so
Mm-hmm.
God decides to hit the reset button, floods everything. And then later in the lifetime of Abraham in the book of Genesis, you have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah that's people in these towns are being particularly wicked, but it doesn't specify. There's one weird story, but there's a destructive event that happens there that
Which, based on context, from what I understand, is also more about the lack of hospitality, but in a very aggressive way. It's not a passive lack of hospitality. It's a way of they were being awful to immigrants and to people that were not from where they were coming into their land.
exactly.
And not about people, being gay and in love or, whatever.
Yeah. And specifically within the difference of what Moses is doing versus what those descriptions are, is that those previous moments where the biblical authors say God brought about destruction of people was for generic human behavior that was not fundamentally religious in nature. When Moses debuts the Ten Commandments, for the first time that we know of in recorded human history, there's the possibility of a death sentence for making a mistake that is exclusively religious in nature. We have,
as it relates to a brand new God, to a God that they didn't even know yet.
Yeah, I draw it out a little bit in chapter 4 of the book where Abraham had a very big blended family. Abraham, in Muslim tradition, Abraham has 3 wives, and from the perspective of the Jews, he never married the Egyptian woman Hagar, who is his servant, but that's a point of debate I'm not interested in parsing out. Mm-hmm. But Abraham has lots of children. The biblical story focuses only on 2, Ishmael and Isaac, but Abraham has a later wife named Keturah, and he has 8 more sons that are named. And then there's a throwaway line in Genesis 25 that says, and Abraham also had multiple sons with multiple other concubines. So he is a biologically very successful man. He has tons of descendants. By the time Moses would have been alive, there would have been tens of thousands of people that could trace they could go on ancestry.com and be like, oh, it's Abraham.
Yeah.
And so,
do you remember that Christian song growing up? Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. And then you list off the tribes of Israel, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in that song. So why do we, so, I mean, even that, like, why do we just honor the 12 instead of like, what makes these, I mean, I know that 12 is a number that's revisited in the New Testament with the disciples. But it's just interesting that the numerology is just so specific, it seems, too.
Yeah, there's, it's a complicated thing, but when I'm retelling the story from the biblical author's perspective, the best we can do from the text themselves and how they make sense of their own history, is that Moses learns a new name for the same God, like the God of Israel or the God of Abraham in particular. As Abraham's descendants migrate down into the Arabian Peninsula, somehow they start using a different name. In what we think of as modern Palestine and Israel, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, the God that was the supreme deity was El, or El Shaddai. And that's El. It's the same linguistic root for Allah in Arabic. It goes back to it's either Il, I-L, or El, E-L. And but there's a pretty different religious culture that happens. We don't know why. We have no records. These were Bedouin people that were following herds. So whether they documented any of their religious culture with things that they wrote down or carved into stone, we have no idea. But suddenly we have this desert community led by Moses' father-in-law, a man named Jethro, who is the priest of Midian. And Moses becomes part of his family, takes on the culture of that family, whereas the Israelites in Egypt are just following the Canaanite, Palestinian, Israelite version of the same religion. And somehow they end up from their perspective, again, this is, and people are free to debate whether these are the same deity or like different regional deities that get merged later. I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. I do that throughout the book. I'm believing the biblical authors and the story they want to tell and that they have told us, and that has been treated as true for centuries. And so so then we have these two traditions. They get kind of merged together a little bit forcefully during the reign of King David. And suddenly the priests are now saying, and Moses is saying most acutely, you're never going to use the name El for God again. You have to use Yahweh. It's really heavy-handed. It's hard in English. You and I are both native English speakers. And in the English Bible, we don't see the names of God. We only see pronouns and epithets. We see Lord, usually in all capital letters, but that means Yahweh. It's a different word in Hebrew than the English word God that we translate is usually El. And so it gets tricky. But the biblical authors, when they're writing the story of Moses, and in particular in the Ten Commandments, it says, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. And that's saying, I am Yahweh. You shall have no other Elohim, which is the generic word for God. And so
but they pluralize it in the English translation.
They do. In the moment at Mount Sinai when Aaron builds a statue, Moses goes away. He's getting those famous stone tablets that he brings down later that have the whole covenant carved on them, written by the finger of God, the text says. But Aaron, like Moses is gone. Moses brought the people there for a religious festival, then he disappears and he doesn't teach them any songs or dances or prayers. He's just gone. And the people, he climbs to the top of a volcano that has lava and fire and smoke. And the people think he's dead. He's gone by the storytelling, like 40 days and 40 nights. It seems like a poetic device. That's how long it took for God to destroy the earth with the flood. It's how long it takes God to rebuild the Israelite people with the law. It seems like a poetic device, but if it's literal, then he's gone for 5.5 weeks. And he tells them they're not allowed to follow him up the mountain. So they're like, he brought us here to say thank you to the God who saved us. Let's just do it without him. And so
in the only way that we know how, because our leader is gone.
Yeah. And so Aaron is the leader that Moses left in charge. The people go to him and they say, build us a statue of God, like all of our ancestors built. We have documentation of this throughout, even later in the Bible, where at the regional synagogues and shrines, called in Hebrew, the word is bamot, it gets written about derisively by the biblical authors. They call them the high places, and they celebrate when these things are destroyed by later kings. But they're just regional sanctuaries where people are having religious events. We recover either textually or sometimes we have the actual items that were deity statues. And one is in the museum in Jerusalem that they found from the 12th century, and it's a small bull statue. And when we have come to think of it as a golden calf that the Israelites are worshiping at Mount Sinai, that's not what the Hebrew words say. It doesn't say golden, it says molten. So it's just molten, it's melted metal. And then the word for bull, or the word for calf, actually means small bull. It's a diminutive masculine noun, agol. And so we see this, we have a physical small bull statue that we have recovered from an archaeological site. And it seems like this is the tradition in Judaism. You build a small metal bull statue, and it's like going into a Hindu temple and you see a statue of Ganesha. You go to Thailand and you see statues of Buddha. And I don't think that we have any evidence to believe that the Israelites thought that this statue contained God.
Right.
It was just a reference point.
Well, and it was also a visual of their experience, in that being molten, that the reason he asked for everybody to give their piercings was because the piercings were what marked them as a permanent slave. Yeah. And so in the work, I think the word that he uses, and maybe I'm saying this wrong, parak, is that right?
Yeah.
which is, it literally means to break apart or tear away or rip out. So it's the act of breaking the chains of bondage that they have been living under for their entire lives. And so if they're able to use these things that marked their chain, marked their slave ship, marked their bondage, and then put this into this gratitude piece to God, it all just makes so much more sense that they were truly giving gratitude for being pulled out of slavery, and the only way that they knew how to do this was to tear off the things that marked them, and to use that to light up in this piece. And then Moses comes down and makes them melt it and then put the dust in their water and drink it and eat it. He's a demigod, right?
In the sorry, I'm just gonna pause. Like, it's a really emotional moment for that story, if you are willing to give value to the lives of the people that Moses led out of Egypt and who are having this celebration, which is described. The biblical authors did not like this version of religion. They make it very clear that they absolutely hated this display. But even from their perspective, they said the people at Mount Sinai were singing, playing, dancing, and sitting down to eat and drink. That's what Moses comes in and makes him so intensely mad that he destroys their statue. And again, he
and also just destroys the only alleged proof of the divine speaking to him in these tablets, right? So, because if you can, I mean, I just wonder if that was in the moment part of his tactic for regaining control, is to, these were, because if people could have questioned the validity of those tablets, is that just effects from the volcano? Is that just the path that, because we don't know that language. You're telling us that you know this language, but we don't even know that to be a language, right?
Yeah, I mean, it
just seems so obvious, and it never seemed so obvious before reading this book.
Yeah, the thing that, I mean, what happens next in the story is, after the early mentions of God carrying out a punishment for generic wickedness, we have this moment at Mount Sinai that I think is one of the most important moments in the religious history of the planet, where after Moses destroys the statue, he decides to punish the people for having broken the second commandment. They've made a deity statue and had a celebration where it was involved. And rather than having God call down the heavens upon them and punish them with lightning, or in the Cecil B. DeMille film, it's so cheesy. It's kind of amazing. Charlton Heston, who's supposed to be he's supposed to be 80 years old in this moment. He comes and he's standing like 100 feet away from where this gigantic cow statue is. And he throws the commandments like torpedoes at the bull statue, and it explodes, and then it starts an earthquake and God swallows them up. And they're merging together a few different biblical motifs there, but it's a really absurd presentation. And the reason I think that Cecil B. DeMille chooses to do that as the demonstration is because that is so much more palatable than what the Hebrew Bible and the book of Exodus tells us happened. Moses assembled a religious army of the Levites, who would later become his spiritual authorities descending from him.
And the Levites were one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Is that right?
They were not entitled to land. So they just functioned as the religious authorities. They were the priests, and eventually they were the priests in charge of.
All the more reason to use this population that doesn't have notoriety. And the way to get them to support you is by telling them, I'm going to give you notoriety. I'm going to give you leadership if you do what I say.
It's a little, it's a tricky moment because they're not in the promised land yet. So that they don't have that, those allocations worked out in this moment.
Okay.
What the text says is the Levites became the rightful priests of Israel in this moment where they respond to Moses. Moses says, "Come to me, everyone who is on Yahweh's side. Strap your sword to your side and go from one end of the encampment to the other, and each of you kill your brother and your friend and your neighbor." So according to the story, again, we don't know if these numbers are real or if they were inflated or changed. But what the text in its current form that we have in its best copy says is that they stabbed to death or beheaded 3,000 of their own people. And they're only error that they had made was that they participated in religion differently than Moses told them to. Yes. And we have no record of anything like that before in all of human history. We have ancient Mesoamerican places where human sacrifice happened. In ancient Canaan, there was a god named Molech that seemed to have been worshipped with human sacrifice, but those were not punitive things. Those were weird and I think misplaced ideas of offerings and gifts to give to God. And in the Aztec culture is usually prisoners of war that they killed as a demonstration of power for their god. But this idea that somebody should lose their life for practicing religion differently than the authorities say has its debut moment at Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
And that's the moment where it says that the Levites earned through violence their right to rule over what would become Israelite religion from thenceforth. And it's so tragic. Like in the book, I try to draw it out. Like those were possibly fathers whose kids would be screaming and crying as their dads died in front of their eyes. All those who were married, they suddenly have thousands of widows in the community. And Moses is treating this as a self-congratulatory moment where he's confirming this is the exact version of society that I want and that I am putting into place. And as I trace through in chapters 6 and 7 of the book, the Israelites tried to resist him. They didn't just sit there passively. They mobilized a resistance movement that then was put down even more violently. And it says, according to the numbers of the biblical authors, who are the only people telling this story, this version they wanted to say is that within the first 2 years of Moses' leadership of the Israelites, 18,000 of his own people were exterminated so as to satisfy the demands of his religious rules. And that is
including one situation where a man was simply picking up sticks on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And then had to be killed for picking up sticks.
Yeah. And it's these moments. I mean, that's this. So the first violation of the 10 Commandments is when Moses comes down the mountain and sees them having a religious ceremony involving the bull calf statue that Aaron had made. And then the second time where anyone is documented violating a 10 Commandment, one of the 10 Commandments, was this man picking up sticks on the Sabbath. And we're given no context. It doesn't say why he was picking them up. It doesn't say if he was confused, because in Exodus chapter 20 is where is the first listing of the 10 Commandments, but it doesn't list any penalties there. It only says in this vague way, anyone who hates God will be punished.
Right.
But that's pretty vague. And it doesn't seem like the guy picking up sticks on a vacation day is inherently hating God in that moment. Like if he's spelling out, I hate God with sticks, that's a different thing, but that's not what the text says. Like, so we have just this moment where, and then the people are obedient to Moses. They bring that guy to Moses. And they're like, okay, he broke the Sabbath. What do we do? Because in the text, they admit it's weird that they include these things. They say, we don't know what should be done with him. And Moses seems like he doesn't know either. So he goes and he prays about it. And God's like, hey, you got to kill that guy too. So Moses forces the whole community to participate, and they pick up rocks and they end his life with blunt force trauma by hitting him over and over again until his life is gone. And this is the framework that Christianity is built on.
Yep.
This is the framework that Islam is built on, that if you fuck up, even in the smallest way as a religious person, you are doomed to death here and now, or in the afterlife, you might be tortured eternally. But that doesn't exist in the time of Moses. There's no afterlife. That comes later. But the question that was really hurting my heart at the end of my time in the church, I was the president of my Christian group in college, and I started learning about injustice around the world. And there's a story that was happening where in this weird, I'm going to go into the modern world. We've been in the ancient world for a while. In India, how a lot of tech support calls get routed to call support centers in Bangalore. And that's led to unfortunate kind of racist depictions of what a tech support person is.
Yeah.
But it was that deal of building up the technological infrastructure of India was a deal between the Indian government and the United States government. And in exchange for our help building up that part of India, the Indian government allowed American biotechnology corporations to bring their genetically modified seeds into Indian agriculture. And while sometimes those seeds that are owned by like Monsanto and Cargill and things can make bigger crops, it's not a guarantee. And so they had a lot of crop failure in Indian agriculture, and the farmers just kept getting into more and more debt, because if your seeds are failing, then they say, you got to use more of our chemical fertilizer. You have to use more of our chemical pesticides. And so there was this wave of suicides that was happening amongst these Hindu farmers whose government had made a deal, and now they were living in the aftermath of this deal. And when I was learning about that, my heart was so broken. And according to my religious commitments at that time, the reward that these poor Hindu farmers would have at the end of a life full of suffering that was inflicted upon them by a governmental decision, they're just passive victims in this environment. They commit suicide. And according to my version of Christianity at the time, they were going to be tortured to death forever. Like, I was so mad that was what my community said was the destiny of people who are just living their lives, that I started researching it. And that's the core of the second half of this book, I think, was born out of that agony I felt about injustice, because the idea that people had to be separated into a good afterlife and a bad afterlife is rooted in this idea that somebody should be punished for expressing their religious impulses differently than someone else.
Yep.
And so I traced that back, and it all goes back to Moses. Moses is mentioned in the Quran more than any other person. It's very clear that Muhammad is doing like a Moses's religion 2.0, because or maybe it's 3.0, because Christianity maybe is the second version of Judaism that kind of took hold. And that is what really my heart for this book is. I want people to understand, one, that this had a decisive moment in history where it began. It wasn't always that way.
Yep.
And I want people to understand that religious diversity always existed.
Yeah.
And before Moses, there was no penalty for doing something different. Like if you were a Greek religious person and you found a particular association with Zeus, great, you could go to the temple of Zeus and that'd be fine. If you liked Athena instead, you could go to hers. If you were a party boy and you wanted to go hang out with Dionysus and like drink hallucinogens with everybody, like, great, that was available. And importantly, that diversity existed in Israelite religion. But what the biblical account seems to do is it tries to hide religious diversity and to only promote the really intense and severe version of religion that Moses and his lineage of Levite priests, who eventually controlled the temple in Jerusalem, that they tried to enforce upon the people who, by and large, seemed they didn't want it. Most of the people rebelled against the temple in Jerusalem as soon as they could. And
then 10 of the 12 tribes ended up actually going with, it's not Josephus, Jephthah, what's his name?
Jeroboam.
I got it all wrong. Jeroboam, yeah.
But it's polysyllabic J word.
Yeah. Thank you for that grace. But that shows to me also that the majority of people found a greater connection to the divine in not adhering to Moses's "my way is the highway." But do you think, I mean, assuming that Moses is real, and for the sake of this conversation, let's assume that he is, getting in the psychology of Moses, because I thought there also was something interesting to consider in that because we don't know anything about Moses's life, but knowing what we don't know, I can imagine that him growing up as an outsider in Egypt always feeling different, never feeling like enough. And then all of a sudden getting elevated to leadership and by going to save his people, he's now hailed, right? He finally is amongst his own. And you even describe it with his son, because his son is the first time he feels like I am with my people, or something like that. I think you word it. But just with that psychology of Moses to become this seemingly evil character, is it all compensatory? Is it all to compensate for his lack of early on in life? You think that now that he's got power, he's going to make sure that others felt the way that he felt? Does it make sense what I'm asking?
It certainly does. And
I know you can't answer for Moses, but
but if we look at the patterns throughout history, we can certainly use them as a template for, and I think we can use this as a compassionate framework. Like, I remember when I was a kid, I was really angry at my dad. He was a workaholic and he wasn't around a lot. And part of my process of letting go of my anger with my father was to learn more about his life, to help understand what might have motivated him to choose work over spending time with his kids as much. From my perspective. Maybe from his perspective, he's like, wow, I'm spending way too much time with my kids. I got to be at work more. But in the case of Moses, what we see is he's an outsider in Egypt from the moment he arrives. And then even like in the moment where he kills the Egyptian who's abusing his fellow Israelite, afterwards, the Israelites don't respect him more for it. There's this amazingly sassy Hebrew man who just like gets right in his face. And he's like, we don't care. Like, what are you going to do to me? Are you going to kill me like you killed that guy? Like,
well, if anything, it may have even put them at greater risk, because now there would be reason for retaliation from Pharaoh.
So we see this kernel of Moses having something in him that makes him more prone to impulsive anger and rage than maybe the average person in the world. But one of the things that we see when people convert to a really intense expression of religion, they often are much more intense about it than somebody who is born into that tradition.
Yeah.
So when Moses leaves Egypt, he flees the entire country, and then he becomes the son-in-law of this man, Jethro, who's the priest of Midian. And we know very little about him other than that the version of animal sacrifices that Jethro knows how to do are seen by the elders of the liberated Israelites. And they see him do that. And it's like, oh, okay, he's doing the same basic religious stuff we're doing.
And he was the chief priest of Midian. Is that right?
Yeah, it's Midian.
Okay.
It seems like nobody's exactly sure what Midian was, whether it was a tribal confederation or a specific geographic place. But
they were followers of Abraham's God.
Yes, that's the biblical account of who these people were. There was a biological son of Abraham named Midian, who seems like, according to Josephus, the Jewish historian in the first century, he says that the descendants of that person, Midian, became the Midianites, and they lived in basically the Arabian Peninsula and the Sinai Peninsula, like around that corner of the Red Sea. And so we have Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. So we don't have a lot of information about him. We know that Moses looks up to him. Jethro shows up and tells Moses that he's not doing his work correctly, where Moses is trying to like adjudicate every little conflict amongst the Israelites. And Jethro comes in and tells him how to basically organize the tribe. And so we know that he's greatly venerated by Moses. And whatever Jethro's version of religion was, seems like it was pretty intense around rules and regulations. And maybe Moses kicked it up a notch.
Yeah.
Maybe Moses was expressing exactly what religion looked like in that.
I'm sure he had some unresolved daddy issues and mother issues, but in this case, I think the daddy issues probably prevailed. And he married his daughter, Jethro's daughter, Zipporah, which later became Sephora, which is the name of one of the biggest cosmetic store. Yeah, exactly. And I even look at their font, and it has a very kind of Egyptian feel to it almost, I just wonder now, like I wanted to go down the rabbit hole of the Sephora brand to see like how they came up with that name. But yeah, it's so he gave his daughter to Moses.
Yeah. And so Zipporah features into this story It was so one of the things that I found challenging in writing the book was to establish the right tone. I wrote twice as many words as appear in the final book. Like I did some hard cuts because one of the things that I've enjoyed in some of your past episodes, and in particular when you're talking with your brother, is like you have a pretty rascally side to you, and we've not really engaged at that level. But I was at a Christian leadership camp. It was a month-long thing. The group I was involved in college is called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and they did a month-long leadership training at this camp, and they brought in people to give sermons each night that we were there. And the only time I ever heard anybody address Zipporah in public was this guy who did the dangerous thing of telling a funny story about a part of the Bible that is weird. And he gave her the nickname Zippy the Snippy because she does an emergency circumcision of Moses' sons. And if she hadn't,
because when they go back and they do that, because when they go back, there's two different methods of circumcision, one being when you're 13, one being when you're 8 days old. So didn't they weren't they the first people to circumcise on the 8th day of life for one of Moses's kids?
Exactly. So it was for Abraham's son Isaac was the first Hebrew infant that is circumcised on the 8th day of life. Abraham's first son Ishmael gets circumcised at age 13. And then the descendants of Ishmael later on, they keep up adolescent circumcision as their right. And then the Israelite people who stayed in Israel, they do the 8th day of life to this day. That's the Jewish ritual. But so Moses' sons growing up in this territory where they do adolescent circumcision, he's bringing them to Egypt amongst the Israelites. And we don't know why, but it says that God gets full of rage and sweeps down, planning to kill Moses for failing to circumcise his sons. But Zipporah very quickly circumcises the boys, and then it says that she wipes the bloody foreskins on Moses' feet. But
that word also it can be translated as to genitals, right?
Yeah.
So it could be that she wiped her kids' bloody foreskins on her husband's genitals.
Yeah.
There are great aspects to following these religions. I don't mean to undermine any of the people that do find guidance here, but it's stories like this that you wonder, why the fuck did you leave that in there? And B, is this manipulated or constructed just to add severity to the storytelling so that you stay in line with what I'm telling you?
Yeah, it's a weird moment. I mean, it's one of the things that I think is an unintended consequence of the fundamentalist Christian movement that you and I both spent time in is the idea that every word of these books is sacred and precious and divine inspired is hard to reconcile with some of these weirder passages. Even in the life of Abraham, who I venerate and respect, it says that he went down to Egypt and he was scared he was going to get killed because his wife was so beautiful. So he has his wife go become the bride of the reigning Pharaoh at the time and consummate that marriage. And then, so it's like this weird potential narrative of international cuckolding. Like, I don't understand exactly what's going on, but Abraham gives his wife to a more powerful man for this moment to spare his life. And it seems like a choice of desperation in the storytelling. But if we're to believe every word of this text is precious and true, then it creates some awkward moments of like, do I have to also include that part?
Right.
Right. And that's why in the way I conclude the story and what I want people to be able to walk away from this experience of is that there's this enormous diversity of religious practice that we can celebrate and honor and use our own creativity to honor the creator, because the understanding of Abraham, and we don't have clear evidence of this, but what might have been his contribution to this lineage is that maybe he only celebrated the chief god El, and he did like a proto version of monotheism. And maybe he ignored all of the other deities. that show up that we have records of archaeologically that were celebrated in the region as part of that exact same system. Like El was the king, but there were a bunch of other deities around him that were subservient to El. So if Abraham was...
Well, and that may match the culture or the regions of people awareness of the divine. And that's why I think it's so limiting to create this one-way system, because then, I mean, like the people that are born in India have a different association with the planet than I do. So they're naturally going to see creation and the creator as different, differently than I do. But the thing I kept asking throughout this book was, well, because you kept, kind of saying that comparing the religion of Moses or the God of Moses to the God of Abraham, and they, to me, read very differently. But the God of Abraham in Genesis 12:3 says, by Abraham, all the families of the earth shall bless themselves, perhaps meaning that the divine knows in creating us, if that's what happened, that we in our creation are creative enough to know how to worship the creator. That's what that verse reads to me. And because I also do want to reiterate, your goal in writing this book is to get us back to a place of freedom, and to not religious extremism, to not the one-way system, which, each system has its own one way. But you put it in the very last line of the book so beautifully: the time has come to be free. When we honor each other as equals before our creator, then heresy ceases to exist. And when heresy dies, we can all know the freedom to live. It was just a perfect message of, because I was, 155 pages. I'm just pissed and livid and like screaming and like, talking out loud to myself like a crazy man. And then I get to page 156 and I'm like, oh, okay, I have peace now. I feel okay.
I'm so glad that was your experience, because I certainly, in the process of writing it and digging into these texts, it is heartbreaking.
Yes.
And that the people who wrote, like, we don't know the exact individuals who wrote this version of the story that's in the Torah, the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. But this was the story they wanted to tell. And it was a story about their version of religion replacing a pre-existing Israelite religious practice. It was two religions came head to head, and they said, ours is the superior one. And if we just step back and acknowledge that maybe that's not right, or maybe we don't want to participate in that system of power and severity and punitive religion, because I don't want anyone to be punished if they pray and use a word that I don't like.
Yep.
Like, that is absurd to me. When I was involved in a fundamentalist Pentecostal church that believed in angels and demons and speaking in tongues. And they said from the pulpit that if you go to a yoga class and the chant involves a Hindu deity name, you open yourself up to demonic possession.
Yep.
And I don't believe that is what the Hindu people are doing who codified what yoga became.
Right.
I think they are honoring a perception of the divine that life is diverse. Life is all over the planet. We've existed for tens of thousands of years. We have temples that have been uncovered in Turkey that are at least 11,000 years old, of people celebrating divinity and our relationship to the cosmos in ways that are beautiful and not bounded by rules that have punishments. And I think that we can participate in traditions that are more biblically authentic, going all the way back to Abraham. Like, I want to attach my legacy and my sense of ancestry to Abraham. Like, I have friends who left evangelicalism to become Catholics because they felt comfort in a tradition that was so old, that people have been doing these same rites and sacraments for so long, that it felt more comforting than fundamentalism, which started in the 1900s, or Pentecostalism that started in the mid 1900s. Like, that you have these experiences suddenly open up where the world can be bigger than the narrow confines that Moses tried to shave down the sides of life to only focus on him and to be afraid of everything else. I think we don't need to be afraid. I think that the creator being whatever that is, I don't know what it is. Like, it just brings me comfort that if I have a moment that fills me with deep gratitude and sometimes worry. I like literally looking up at the moon. I'm a night person. And if I see the moon and I just feel gratitude in my heart, and sometimes I'll say it out loud. Or I was driving the other day, you and I both live in California, and rain is hard to come by. We're in a 17-year drought. And I was looking at a cloud and talking out loud to it as I'm driving, like, drop all your rain, give us all you got. And if you just insert the name of a sky god right there, I'm doing the same thing that a farmer did 8,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Like that, substantively, I'm expressing a hope bigger than I can feel towards something I have no control over, but I know I need rain on my crops. I know we need our reservoirs refilled in California. Like we can't just buy Dasani our whole life.
Right.
Like that and that human experience is profoundly human.
Yeah.
And if I divorce myself from a tradition that requires me to act punitively towards others, or that they do it to each other, then I can celebrate with everyone on the planet who has a divine impulse, who feels that gratitude, who feels that worry, who needs to bond together against bullies and villains, like what's happening in Ukraine right now. Like those people can use the tools of feeling the divinity of one another to marshal their courage to stand up against violent perpetrators of war.
Yeah.
Like we can do that. And that's, I think, the best version of this. Like
yes. And it also made me wonder if Moses had never been, or Moses was not the person that he allegedly was from this book, would, Ishmael and Abraham, and would they be getting along? Would there be the division that we have today in the Middle East? Because right now, that whole battle is over who has the connection to the real God. Who is it? Is it Yahweh? Is it Allah? Is it Jesus? But if Moses had never established this practice of weaponizing belief systems, would we be where we are today in the world? I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't know if there would have been someone who would come along to act like Moses did, but it certainly looked different. I mean, there was plenty of violence in the world before this, but as far as having specific religious violence and religious death penalties and what happened, there's an event that I got access to because of my wife's Jewish community. It happens during Yom Kippur, where during the Spanish Inquisition, a lot of Jews, to save the lives of themselves and their families, swore oaths to the inquisitors saying, I believe in Jesus and Jesus is the best. He's great. Please don't kill me. And the ones that got spared, they created this beautiful ritual in that community. And these are descendants of Moses too. And there's a moment in the Yom Kippur service where if anyone had to take on a false vow for survival, the community forgives them. And it just makes, the first time I experienced it, I just teared up. It's such a beautiful.
What's it called, this event?
I'd have to look it up. I don't know the Hebrew name for that moment, but, and I don't know if it's in every community's Yom Kippur practice, but that this idea that these religious overlords who are threatening you with death, if you have to appease them to preserve your family because they're being assholes, survival is what is important, and we, your community, will still love you. But I have a hope for and a vision for the future that people can just let go of this.
Yeah.
That the allegiance to religious punishment, whether it's in the here and now, or whether people attach that punishment to the afterlife of heaven and hell, which is a much later invention that also, like Moses' religious death penalties, started. And before that, they didn't exist. The idea of punishing people with hell has a beginning. And before that, the idea of hell didn't exist.
Right.
So these are tools that we've used to control one another, to shame one another, to force people into types of relationships they don't want to have, to deny the legitimacy of homosexual experience or homosexual relationships. I mean, I know that your audience has interest in both religion and making sure that people have equal rights.
Yeah.
Like those things all got narrowed by Moses' punitive society. And those are the bedrock principles of why people are still doing the don't say gay nonsense in Florida. Like that has its roots in this punitive religious idea that if you behave differently than the authorities, you're offending a deity.
Yep.
You're offending the creator of the universe. And I think that is ridiculous. And that needs to just fade away. Like, I hope that at the end of the book, people can just let some of this just roll off their back and feel free from that pressure. Like, I don't want Moses' tradition. I'm going to go back before him.
Yeah.
And to people that, again, like Muslims, Christians, and Jews, the creator God is the God of Abraham. It's not the God of Moses. You don't owe anything to Moses.
Yep. I did. My first thought after reading this book was, I want to get to know the God of Abraham, because I think, unbeknownst to me, I've only been taught the God of Moses, and that's not a God that I can serve.
Yeah.
Or honor or appreciate. Let's wrap up here. This has been, I cannot wait to go back and listen to this just to make sure I'm catching everything you're saying, because I feel like there's just so much. But what would you say to the divine were they standing before you today?
I would say thank you for life. I don't know why it happened, but I'm grateful to have experienced it.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful for you for being here to share your expertise, your grace, your knowledge, and this book. I cannot wait for people to find out about it and to gain access to it. I just am so much appreciation for your time today. I cannot thank you enough.
It's my pleasure. I really, just listening through some of your catalog, I felt like we were on the same wavelength. And
I'm glad you reached out. It really, this book has just done so much for my own religious healing and release of trauma. So thank you. I look forward to talking with you again, because I'm sure there is more we can discuss.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt.
All right, take care.
And all the people said, gay men. Thank you all for listening to another episode of the Fagnostic Podcast, hosted by me, Matt Hayes. You can find me at matthayes.com, that's MATHAYES.com, or on Just the Millennial socials at Hayes on It, HAYES on it. Please go subscribe, review, and share this podcast. And in the meantime, peace be with all y'all.
Hi, Michael Spicer here. Matt Hayes forgot to put my name in the credits of his podcast as the composer, but I'm here to tell you that I wrote the music for his podcast. Whatever it's called, I don't know.